The Aether Conference. Bells rang through the air, filling the halls with a radiant clanging. The royal choirs had begun their choruses and given the signal for all who would be attending the King's Conference to make their way to the halls of debate. The halls were a trio of vast, rectangular rooms that were illuminated by a continuous hanging chandelier made of strings of crystal. The walls were a pure white, disrupted only by the lines of chants and calligraphy along their sides in gold. The heads of each of the three halls met at a single point. There was a single large throne, covered in a velvet-like blue fabric, encrusted in gold at every point that gold could be used. Now there were men in large robes, calling out into the world, "Come all who would enter. The king beckons his council. Come all." To this end, droves of men and women in elegant robes, crowns, and jewelry had begun to make their way into the hall. The seats of the halls filled quickly with the royal crowd. The least impactful members of the conference had been seated. The next group of people making their way into the halls now were the warriors of the royal guard, the nation's army. Their captain, Killian, made his way down the aisles, not in proper dress robes, but in full battle garments. He was the type of man who lived by the nature of his profession. He was always ready for a battle, and he encouraged a certain roughness and warrior spirit in all of the army, mandating the strict adherence to principles of combat nature. His sword, crested in gold, was his badge of rule over the fighting forces of the kingdom. By his side was Shopu, the second in command of the royal army. She was an even more enigmatic figure than her senior. Her wild nature and strong gaze had garnered her the ire of most civilized people in the nation, but had also won her many an award for gallantry on the battlefield. They both led a fighting force of over 500,000. Only 200 of those warriors, though, being represented amongst those in the hall today. This was the advance guard, a section of men and women who had abandoned their families and futures for the kingdom. The men in large robes, calling to the nation to fill the hall, were now broadcasting a different message. They called to the room of the arrival of the king and his personal guard. King Uta, the recent former prince, a golden-eyed man with a thinly built frame. He was beautiful and pampered. His skin was barely ever touched by the sun, and his voice even more scarcely allowed to be set free into the world. Most of his actions were simply nods of approval of the options presented to him. He entered the room, surrounded on each side by a member of the king's blades, elite warriors whose only job was to kill those who would endanger the king. There were so many rumors about these warriors, their feats in battle, personal resumes, and the circumstances of each of their appointments. The king sat on his throne, looking out into the sections of the halls at his people. He took a shallow breath and gave silent approval for the callers to welcome the wardens into the hall. These were the true guests of honor, the four wardens of the spirit. The men in the robes called out into the halls for the hymns of spirits, and all at once the rooms were filled with a melodic chorus of alternating voices. They were calling to the world beyond their own, a realm of spirits and energy. In the midst of the hymn, butterflies cascaded from the ceiling and filled a seat at the head of the hall at a large table. They were joined by a raven and a snake that continuously swallowed its tail. Each of them moved frantically until materializing into a woman each. The snake, a young girl with a beautiful white and yellow dress. Her skin was pale, and in her eyes radiated life itself. The raven transformed itself into an old woman, skin wrinkled and ebony, and her hair tangled white from time. Her eyes were bare and boundless. The butterflies began to take the form of a teenage girl, eyes full of fire and power. She bore armor and dagger. 3 of the 4 seats had been filled by the guests of honor. The last of these women was making her way down the long runway of the halls to her seat. She walked slowly, her eyes weeping and full of sorrow, and her dress tattered and damp. As she approached her seat, she turned to glance at the room over her shoulder and revealed a face full of contempt. The old woman looked at her and patted the seat next to her. "Come on." Her voice was soft and welcoming, but authoritative all the same. At the head of the hall, a tall man with beaten armor and a large blade, a dismounted guillotine, closed the doors and stood ready. An ominous white smoke emanated from him, and he motioned to the women that he was ready. The men in the robe called one last time. "Hear all! Hear now that the conference of the Aether has been called into session. This is a topic of war and the survival of our mighty kingdom." A spokesman of the king came to the forefront and began to brief the room on the matter at hand. "We, the kingdom of Lysalgia, have been called to defense against the forces which have plotted to invade the Aether. They have been known for eons to the universe as beings of hunger. They move from world to world, claiming the energies of nature and draining the life essence until there is none left for the living of the natural inhabitants. We have on our side the wardens of natural energies in ether. Spring, summer, fall, and winter, all rise." The room rose in one unified motion and acknowledged the presence of the women. "We have with us the guardian of the spring of energies, Madadoku, the champion squall, the tempest of Ear. All rise." The room rose again to pay homage to the mightiest warrior in the assembly. Commander Killian silently scoffed. His face turned a half grimace that went unnoticed by mortals and ignored by the rest of the guests. Mistress Winter, in particular, found the gesture amusing. She knew of the fragile hearts of men and chose to keep from reprimanding him on his injury of honor. "Now all listen carefully to the words following my voice. They shall be the words of those with an effort to protect the kingdom." There was a moment of silence, and the next voice was that of the king. "Which of those assembled here today would know a way of which to stop the horde, by which we know as the consumers of ether?" Another silence fell about the room again, until Commander Killian threw his voice into the halls with a declaration of defense. "We of the royal army, the guard of the king, pledge all of our men to the battle against the invaders. We will conquer their conquerors and uphold the honor of the crown. Your Eminence." Old Woman Winter smirked again. She found herself thoroughly amused at the arrogance of the mortal commander. Surely he was simply uneducated as to what this enemy was capable of. She motioned to Spring, and the young girl danced out of her seat. She traced patterns in the air until projections of strange men filled the room. They had armor like monsters, and their vicious fighting and gore inspired a special breed of disgust in the noble audience. Scenes with dragons, mangled horses, and beasts that these people had never seen before made them see the oncoming violence in a different light. What warrior of the kingdom could compete with the hell flame of the bellowing worms they saw before them? Commander Killian said again, "I am not perturbed. We will defend the kingdom against anything and anyone." Winter rose from her seat, a smile on her face, and her hands clasped together. She moved to comfort the warrior. She could feel his heart out of place. mismatched to the threat and struggling to keep his sense of placement in the room. She kept her head low, talking to him in the sweetest tones she could muster.
You are a mighty and valiant warrior. Your peers among the mortal lot are few. But listen to me when I tell you that no mere man stands a chance against this force. Your strength is only equal to, or maybe slightly surpassing that of a foot soldier of this force.
Her speech was interrupted by the booming of a vision from Spring's projection. A mighty warrior with a long curved sword enveloped the room, and his image towered over them.
This is Israel Maluk, the general of the strike force of our enemy. He has already been in the ether, seeking to steal the heart of the guardian of ethers.
The crowd gasped and panicked, wondering how bad the intrusion must have been.
The only reason we're not all gone right now is the battle prowess of Madadoku.
She pointed at the immense warrior and continued to speak.
Their battle was a standstill. Madadoku, the great tempest, the reaper of life, and the guardian of the natural ether, was not able to pull out a clear victory.
The general rebutted. Maybe your champion is not as great as you would like him to be. Old woman Winters scoffed.
Well, meet him in battle.
Her quick retort was met on the other end of the hall by Madadoku, opening his mighty maw and chuckling. The truth of the matter was that Madadoku had the ability to slaughter every soldier in the room in a matter of seconds. Even though none of the humans here had ever seen him wield his weapon, they all knew that he was a being of otherworldly power. Winter walked over to the center of the hall with a slow pace and looked back at the commander.
We are not here to retire the army, nor are we here to shame your valor.
The warrior relaxed his stance and settled into a more agreeable mindset. He watched as the old woman moved back down the aisle towards them.
We are here to make sure that everyone can live through this.
The wardens stood and went out into the hall. They each raised their hands and let loose projections of people from another world. They looked ordinary enough, even though they were dressed strangely.
We can make channelers, mages, to focus the energy through the legends and spirits of the worlds. We will put them here to fight, dividing a touch of our own energies amongst them to multiply their own latent abilities.
Everyone was trusting in the understanding of their wardens. The king gave his consent where it wasn't needed, and the women went out into the beaches to begin the ritual. Spring and Summer stepped out into the shore, at the border of the water and the sand. Their arms extended upwards, towards the sun, and they pulled forth the moon in its shadow. The women danced like fragile ballerinas, tracing circles, generating after images of other limbs, and drawing ether from all four wardens. The waters of the beach rose and climbed the air as if they were stirring from a long slumber. Sand began to float, turning to fine gems like diamonds. Spring bowed and extended her arms out like a mighty bird. This created a space in the ether for the channelers to be born into the world. She bowed lower, taking a knee. With this, 7 souls were trapped in her energy and made ready. Summer extended her arms upwards, one arm higher than the other, and seemed to grasp at something. Her torso undulated and pulled the souls into the world until there were 7 souls in freefall through the ether, crashing down into the endless libraries of ether and legends.